2 years ago today, we were stood here with the world's press where we released the first bison into the Blean.
On July 18, 2022, wildlife rangers opened a transport crate at the edge of a pine plantation near Canterbury in the English county of Kent, and 3 female European bison stepped out into woodland that had not held a single wild bison anywhere in Britain for roughly 6,000 years. A young bull, shipped over from Germany, joined them a few weeks later to complete the founding herd. Within months, the animals had already begun tearing bark from trees, flattening pathways through dense understory, and churning bare earth into open ground, and biologists monitoring the site watched a forest that decades of conventional conservation work had failed to fix start changing in ways nobody expected to happen this quickly. Before we get into how that happened, if you're into real, deeply researched nature stories like this one, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. The forest the bison were released into, West Blean and Thorndon Woods, was not the kind of ancient, thriving woodland the phrase might suggest. Much of the site had been planted with commercial pine plantations starting in the 1970s, dense, uniform stands of trees grown for timber rather than biodiversity, which had shaded out the understory vegetation and left large sections of the woodland dominated by just a handful of species. Conventional woodland management, chainsaws, mechanical clearing, and controlled cutting had been applied to parts of the site for years without producing the kind of structural diversity ecologists knew a healthy ancient woodland needed to support a genuinely wide range of insects, birds, reptiles, and understory plants. The organizations behind the project, the Wildwood Trust and Kent Wildlife Trust, working together under the name Wilder Blean and funded substantially through the People's Postcode Lottery at a cost of roughly £1.5 million, made a specific bet that reintroducing an animal capable of physically reshaping the landscape through its own everyday behavior could accomplish more for the woodland's biodiversity than continued human intervention ever could. European bison were chosen specifically because of behaviors unique among the animals available for this kind of project. They strip bark from trees as they feed, occasionally killing individual trees outright and creating standing deadwood, a resource full of insect life and cavity nesting opportunities that a uniformly living, densely packed pine plantation simply could not provide. They push over smaller trees and trample dense undergrowth as they move through woodland in herds, opening gaps in the canopy that let sunlight reach the forest floor for the first time in years. And they wallow, rolling in dust and dry earth to coat their fur and deter insects, carving out bare patches of exposed soil that become their own distinct microhabitat, ideal for ground-nesting insects, reptiles basking in direct sunlight, and pioneer wildflower species that need open, disturbed ground to germinate at all. The choice of European bison specifically, rather than any other large grazing animal, reflected the species' own dramatic history. European bison came within a hair of complete extinction less than a century before the Kent release. The last wild individual died in Poland in 1919, and for years afterward the species survived only in a small number of zoo enclosures scattered across the continent. Every European bison alive today, an estimated 7,500 animals as of the early 2020s, descends from just a dozen founding individuals bred in captivity before the species was gradually reintroduced to wild and semi-wild sites across Poland, the Netherlands, Romania, and elsewhere, starting in the 1950s. The 4 animals released into West Blean in 2022 carried that same recovery story directly into England for the first time. An older matriarch from the Highland Wildlife Park in Scotland, 2 younger females from Ireland's Fota Wildlife Park, and the young German bull who arrived weeks after the initial release, specifically to establish breeding potential within the new herd. European bison are often confused with their more famous American cousins, but the two differ in ways directly relevant to how each shapes the landscape it lives in. European bison carry a leaner, longer-legged build than American bison, with a head held higher off the ground and a diet skewed more toward browsing woody vegetation, shrubs, and tree bark, especially through the winter and early spring months before fresh grass growth becomes available. American bison, by contrast, hold their heads lower and feed predominantly on grasses at ground level, a difference in browsing height and feeding style that reflects each species' evolutionary history in very different landscapes, open grassland plains in North America versus a patchwork of forest and clearing across much of prehistoric Europe. That browsing behavior is precisely why European bison were selected for a project centered on restoring a wooded landscape rather than open grassland, since a European bison's natural preference for stripping bark and browsing shrub layers maps directly onto the kind of woodland disturbance Wilder Blean's organizers were hoping to recreate. The site itself required substantial preparation before any bison could be safely released. Because European bison can weigh well over a ton and are legally classified as dangerous wild animals under British law, the woodland had to be licensed and secured specifically to contain a herd of up to 10 animals, divided into 5 separate compartments connected by wildlife corridors, with specially constructed bison-sized tunnels built at every point where the animal's roaming area crossed an existing public footpath, allowing walkers and bison to share the same landscape without ever directly encountering one another on the same path. The Dangerous Wild Animals Act, the piece of British legislation governing how the bison herd could legally be kept and licensed, dates back to 1976 and was originally written with private ownership of animals like big cats and venomous snakes in mind, long before anyone anticipated it would apply to a conservation project reintroducing an extinct in Britain species into managed woodland. Navigating that licensing framework required Kent Wildlife Trust and the Wildwood Trust to demonstrate that the West Blean site could contain a herd of dangerous wild animals safely, satisfying requirements around fencing, public access management, and emergency response planning before any bison could legally be released. The resulting infrastructure, secure boundary fencing, dividing the reserve into 5 separate compartments, dedicated wildlife corridors connecting them, and specially built bison-sized tunnels at every point where the animal's range crossed an existing public footpath, reflects just how much regulatory and physical groundwork had to be completed years in advance of the actual 2022 release. The results, once the animals actually settled into the woodland, arrived faster than many of the researchers monitoring the project had anticipated. Within the herd's first months on site, rangers documented visible bark stripping and trampling activity reshaping sections of the pine plantation, opening gaps in the canopy and creating the kind of structural variety, some areas open and sunlit, others still densely wooded, that ecologists consider essential for supporting a genuinely diverse range of woodland wildlife. Then, in October of 2022, just months after the initial release, the project received a discovery nobody had planned for. One of the younger females, it turned out, had already been pregnant before her release and gave birth to the first wild European bison calf born in Britain in thousands of years. Bison naturally conceal pregnancy as a survival strategy against predators, making the birth a genuine surprise even to the rangers monitoring the herd closely, and the project quickly adapted its care plan to support the unexpected new arrival. Dedicated rangers have played a central, hands-on role in the project since its earliest planning stages, monitoring the herd daily and managing the delicate process of introducing new animals, tracking pregnancies, and studying how the bison's behavior shifts across the seasons. Tom Gibbs, one of 2 rangers assigned specifically to the Wilder Blean bison, has described the surprise of discovering the first pregnancy in particular, noting that bison naturally conceal being in calf as a survival mechanism against predation, a trait that made the October 2022 birth almost impossible to predict in advance, despite close daily monitoring of the herd. That level of individualized attention, rangers who can recognize each animal, track its history, and respond quickly to unexpected developments like an undetected pregnancy, reflects a broader pattern seen across nearly every successful reintroduction project of this kind, where the presence of dedicated, experienced staff on the ground often matters as much to a project's success as the underlying ecological theory behind it. The herd's growth continued from there. By the mid-2020s, Kent Wildlife Trust reported that the original founding population had doubled in size, and biodiversity monitoring across the site documented thriving populations of species that benefit directly from the kind of disturbed, structurally varied habitat the bison's natural behavior creates. Butterflies and other insects drawn to the newly opened grassland patches, and reptiles using the bare, sun-warmed ground the animal's wallowing behavior leaves behind. The project's momentum led to additional funding, including a further £100,000, specifically aimed at expanding how freely the bison and other introduced grazing animals, including Iron Age pigs, Exmoor ponies, and Longhorn cattle, brought in as complementary ecosystem engineers, could roam across an even larger area of the reserve. The species returned to Britain, after an absence stretching back roughly 6,000 years, also arrived at a moment of genuine crisis for the country's woodlands more broadly. Conservation organizations across the UK have identified inadequate woodland management as one of the 8 leading drivers of species decline nationwide, with dense, poorly structured woodland offering far less habitat variety than the mixed, disturbed forest landscapes that once supported a much wider range of native wildlife across Britain before large grazing animals were hunted out of the country over previous centuries. That broader ecological context shaped how ambitious Wilder Blean's organizers were willing to be with the project's stated goals from the outset, describing it not merely as an interesting experiment with an unusual animal, but as a potential demonstration of an entirely different philosophy for managing Britain's remaining ancient woodlands, one built around reintroducing missing ecological processes rather than continuing to substitute human labor for the natural disturbance those landscapes had evolved alongside for thousands of years before humans removed the animals responsible for it. Wilder Blean's broader significance within Britain's rewilding movement extends well beyond its own woodland boundaries. Conservationists working on similar projects elsewhere in the UK have pointed to the Kent site specifically as proof of concept for an approach that had previously been discussed mostly in theory, using large herbivores as active, ongoing habitat managers rather than relying exclusively on periodic human intervention through cutting, clearing, and controlled burning. Scientists studying the potential scale of bison-driven habitat restoration across Europe as a whole have estimated the species could help restore habitat across an area exceeding 180,000 square miles if reintroduction efforts continued expanding across the continent's remaining forest and woodland regions, a figure that places Wilder Blean's 4 founding animals within a much larger, continent-wide restoration movement that gained significant momentum only in the years immediately preceding the Kent release. Wilder Blean's organizers have also been careful to frame the project as complementary to, rather than a replacement for, other grazing animals introduced to the same woodland. Alongside the bison, the reserve is now home to Iron Age pigs whose rooting behavior turns over soil and leaf litter in ways that create yet another distinct type of disturbed ground. Exmoor ponies, a hardy native breed suited to year-round outdoor grazing across rougher terrain, and longhorn cattle, which graze more conventionally on grasses and help maintain open glades, the bison's browsing alone might not fully sustain. Kent Wildlife Trust has described this combination of species as working together to create a genuinely varied mosaic of habitat types across the site, each animal contributing a slightly different kind of ecological disturbance that, together, produces a far more structurally diverse woodland than any single species, bison included, could achieve entirely on its own. Public interest in the project grew alongside the ecological results. By 2026, construction had begun on a network of elevated pedestrian bridges designed specifically to let visitors safely view the bison herd from above, part of a broader ambition among the project's organizers to demonstrate that this kind of hands-off, animal-driven habitat restoration could serve as a working blueprint other conservation organizations across Britain and beyond might replicate on their own land. Kent Wildlife Trust has described the underlying philosophy driving the entire effort in blunt terms: introducing the right ecosystem engineer species to a landscape, then stepping back and letting natural behavior do work that decades of direct human management, however well-intentioned, had never fully managed to accomplish on its own. The project's funders and organizers have also been candid that Wilder Blean represents an active, ongoing scientific study rather than a finished demonstration, with detailed monitoring of soil composition, insect populations, bird activity, and vegetation structure continuing across the site years after the initial release, specifically so the project can generate rigorous, quantified evidence rather than relying purely on visible anecdotal change. That distinction matters for how seriously other conservation organizations across Britain and Europe have taken the project's early results, since a rewilding effort backed by continuous methodical data collection carries far more weight as a genuine proof of concept than one relying solely on dramatic before and after photographs, even when, as at West Blean, the visible transformation has itself been striking enough to draw sustained media and public attention on its own. Visitor access to the reserve has been carefully phased to balance public interest against the herd's own need for undisturbed space, particularly during the early years while the animals were still settling into unfamiliar territory. Rather than opening the bison's roaming area directly to unrestricted foot traffic, Kent Wildlife Trust designed the site's public-facing infrastructure, including the elevated viewing bridges begun in 2026, specifically to let visitors observe the herd from a safe, controlled vantage point without entering the animal's core habitat directly, an approach the organization has described as balancing genuine public engagement with the reserve's primary conservation purpose. That careful sequencing, securing the site, releasing the animals, monitoring their early adjustment, and only then gradually building out visitor infrastructure once the herd had established itself, reflects a level of long-term planning that extended years beyond the widely publicized moment those first 3 bison stepped out of their transport crate in July of 2022. Groundwork that rarely makes it into the headlines, but that determined almost everything about whether the release itself would actually succeed. If you enjoy real, verified stories from the wild edges of nature, like this video, leave a comment letting me know what you thought and subscribe for more. I will see you in the next one.